We're really excited to hear James' perspective. History never gets old, restoring the forgotten legacy of our national parks. There's a version of American history that many of us have never learned. And James is here to speak about his career and his writing to make sure stories get told. He is a National Geographic Explorer, award-winning journalist, author, media producer who specializes in outdoor recreation, environmental conservation, and the untold stories of people of color in America's wild places. He's the author of The Adventure Gap, Changing the Face of the Outdoors, named by Outdoor Magazine as one of the 10 outdoor books that shaped the last decade. Now he has a long-running blog and podcast called The Joy Trip Project, and he's been reporting on the business, art, and culture of the outdoor life since 2009. He explores diversity, equity, inclusion in public land management, and he's bringing that lens to look at our national parks, monuments, battlefields, and historic sites, and tell the story of the ones whose stories aren't being told, who built this country. We welcome James Edward Mills. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. This is my very first time at South by Southwest. And I was asked this morning if my talk has an AI component. So I'm going to call that actual intelligence. And from that, I'm going to share with you a bit of history. And I call this talk, History Never Gets Old, because I quite literally believe that there's always something new that we can learn from the past. And this photograph, I think, is illustrative of that. Some of you might recognize this as the Independence Bridge. In fact, we just celebrated the 61st anniversary of several series of events that happened during the Civil Rights era. And part of my work as a storyteller is going to historic places, visiting them as they are today, and telling new stories about them. So a couple of years ago, my National Geographic photographer partner and I visited the Independence Bridge. His name is Chris Graves. Now you might recognize his face, but you might recognize his work. In 2020, he did the cover art for the National Geographic Year in Pictures. And this was literally right after the events that led to the removal of several national park that led to several events in our history where national monuments were being removed, particularly monuments that were dedicated to the story. Okay, I was projecting. I didn't realize that y'all couldn't hear me. They're dedicated to the history of the Confederacy. And when I saw this photograph, I literally I wrote to Chris on Instagram. I said, your work is amazing. I would love to partner with you. It would be great to collaborate one day. He'd never met me. He had no idea who I was. Would you believe it or not, he contacted me less than a minute later, and we've been friends and partners ever since. It's from this story that we began our journey as a collaborative partnership, visiting sites around the South. On a trip in particular between Anniston, Alabama, and Tuskegee. And our plan at the time was to tell the story of the U.S. Civil Rights Trail. And we actually started to visit a place in Tuskegee that is the home of the Tuskegee Airmen, the World War II bomber and combat pilots that were trained to fight in World War II. For those of you who may not be familiar with this story, these were African-American men who, during the Jim Crow era in the middle of World War II, were trained to be fighter pilots. And despite having been in a completely segregated army, they served their country valiantly. This is an amazing story, and it's told beautifully at the Tuskegee Airmen Base. It's actually part of a very long civil rights trail that's managed by the National Park Service. And I started out this journey with the intention of understanding a little bit about the history of Black Americans in the United States as interpreted by the National Park System. And it took us to an area that is geographically known as the Black Belt. And this is an area that has a very high concentration of people of color as residents. And essentially, our understanding of the Black Belt was that it was descriptive of the people who live there. But one of the things that's interesting, if you look at this geologically, 70 million years ago, this area of the country was actually underwater. And this region that was the former coast of the North American continent was submerged underwater. And in this spot, millions of microscopic organisms deposited calcium carbonate 70 million years ago during the Cretaceous period and created a high concentration of fertile soil that is actually described as black in color. So the black belt is actually not a description of the people, but the soil in which they live. And it's from this that we have a new understanding of the geological formations that ultimately define many of our national parks. Now, many of you are probably familiar with places like Yosemite, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, and a place I like to visit, Denali in Alaska. And all of these are places that have tremendous geological history, but they also have quite a bit of not only historical history in terms of the foundation of our country, but also the people who made these places possible. And with this intersection, actually as well, is the civil rights movement. Now, everybody is probably familiar with people like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, Rosa Parks. These historic figures actually make up our understanding of our civil rights history. But that story actually has a direct intersection with my own life. Now, you all recognize the guy on the left. The guy on the right is my dad. My father, Billy G. Mills, was the very first African-American to graduate from UCLA Law School in 1954. He was also among one of the first black city councilmen for the city of Los Angeles. He ultimately became a Superior Court judge, but he spent much of his life as a civil rights activist, specifically in the areas around both civil rights, but most specifically police-motivated violence. And during the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. literally came to Los Angeles to ask my dad for advice about how to manage some of the legal ramifications that were happening in Alabama at the time. And so as a kid growing up, these are not the stories that I was told even by my own parents. My dad literally was the guy who encouraged me just to be a good person, who as a new college graduate literally said, James, you can do whatever it is that you want to do with your life. And the day that this picture was taken was the day I graduated from the University of California at Berkeley with a degree in anthropology. At this moment in time, all I knew is that my dad was a judge, a very cool guy. He took me camping. And much of our lives together, we actually spent quite a bit of time in our national parks. Not long before that photograph was taken, this photograph was taken with my very best friend, John Mayer. During spring break in our senior year, we hiked down to the bottom on a rim-to-rim journey of the Grand Canyon. We're literally going all the way down to the bottom to see this amazing geological formation. And from that, I began a long career of storytelling, also in a career in sales and marketing, telling stories about our national parks in a podcast and blog series called The Joy Trip Project, now in its 18th season, created in 2009. Also, it's from these narratives that I created my book, The Adventure Gap, Changing the Face of the Outdoors. And with a grant from the National Geographic Society, I'm currently working on a project to tell the long history of Black Americans as interpreted by the National Park Service in a project called Unhidden. And in advance of the release of my book, I've created a series of stories in 1-minute increments called the Unhidden Minute, in which this year, in the 100th anniversary of Black History Month, we're actually celebrating what I'm describing as Black History Year. And it's interesting because as we look at these interpretive stories, these narratives, we come to a very interesting understanding. Now, how many of you have heard the phrase, history repeats itself? We've heard that before. Well, Mark Twain says that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Okay? The narratives that we tell ourselves actually don't actually repeat themselves, but there are indeed recurring themes. And if we take a look at these themes going all the way back to the foundation of our country, we learn that there are some things that we might not have been told. So, for example, this is an illustration that I commissioned by a very talented artist by the name of Nate Taylor to help me to create a consistent series of images of people of historical significance that predate photography. This is a man who lived between the years 1803 and 1850. He's an enslaved person by the name of York, and he was the manservant of a man that you might be familiar with by the name of William Clark. William Clark was the second half of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They literally traveled from St. Louis, Missouri over the course of over 2,000 miles to the Pacific coast to be the very first people in the newly created United States of America to establish a western route to the west. York, as a outdoorsman, someone who had spent a great deal of time in Kentucky hunting, fishing, trapping, was a particularly important member of this expedition. And with the help of a small grant from the National Park Service, we retraced the Lewis and Clark expedition, quite literally tracking its route specifically through an area called the White Cliffs section of Montana. And it was here that we literally told the story of York in an interpretive storytelling exercise, quite literally going to the place where he camped, where they spent time. But most importantly, what we realized was that we had a new story to tell about how African Americans had a direct connection between our expansion of the United States in the early 1800s. York, as a person of color, was actually revered by Native people because of the color of his skin. In many Native traditions, the pigment black is literally of spiritual significance, and he was described as having big medicine. And that medicine essentially was very attractive to Native people so that they were eager to welcome this group of Eastern explorers into the inland territory so that they could meet this man. And what's especially interesting is that it suggested that had it not been for York, Lewis and Clark never would have made it out of the state of Iowa. They made it all the way back to the state of Portland, to Portland, Oregon. Retracing this exercise, we literally were able to create a documentary film called Big Medicine York Outdoors, which is actually premiering at the DC Environmental Film Festival in 2 weeks. And through this story, we actually have the ability to tell a new interpretation of the United States. Historical figures that we have not had a chance to meet directly have a tremendous impact on the stories that we tell ourselves as a nation. This man, an enslaved person by the name of Stephen Bishop, circa 1839, was the very first guide of one of America's very first tourist attractions, a spot in Kentucky called Mammoth Cave. Mammoth Cave essentially was and continues to be a 400-mile underground labyrinth through which Stephen Bishop actually did most of the principal guiding. He named many of the features and the artifacts, and he did this in the 1830s as an enslaved person. In fact, among the many people that he guided through Mammoth Cave was an aspiring poet by the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And it was from his visit to Mammoth Cave that he spent time in a place called the Star Chamber. We saw or seemed to see the night heaven thick with stars glimmering over our heads. All the party were touched with astonishment and pleasure. It's this understanding of the physical locations of our national parks that we start realizing that we have the transcendental properties of being able to have a positive experience with nature and ultimately, hopefully, being able to protect and preserve these places for all time. What's interesting is that 5 generations of African Americans guided Mammoth Cave from 1839 all the way to 1945. 5 generations of African Americans were principal caretakers of this site until, ironically, it became a national park. At that time, because it was subject to Jim Crow segregation, all African and Native American people were asked to leave the park. And it was only until the 1990s where my good friend Jerry Bransford, a fifth-generation descendant of Stephen Bishop, went back to Mammoth Cave to lead trips and tours through the parks, where he now does so today at the age of 80. The national parks, the best idea we ever had. Absolutely American, absolutely democratic. They reflect us at our best rather than our worst. The poet and naturalist Wallace Stegner described the national parks as the best idea we ever had. And I think that it's that reflection of the roles that we have to play in our understanding of our national parks as a place of both democratic and social and environmental justice. During the earliest days of the creation of our national parks, after the Civil War in the 1860s and 1870s, African Americans were tasked with protecting and patrolling the newly designated national parks at Yellowstone, Sequoia, and Yosemite. Members of the 25th Infantry based in Missoula, Montana, were tasked with protecting and patrolling specifically the region around Yellowstone. And what's interesting is that these men, essentially men who'd survived the Civil War, this is in advance of the First World War, were literally living their lives in communion with nature. And it's from this unit that they established an interesting experiment to see if one day the bicycle could be used as a replacement for the horse. 20 volunteers from Fort Missoula, Montana, rode bicycles from Missoula to Mammoth Hot Springs in Yellowstone National Park. And what's interesting is that this is literally 8 years after the invention of the pneumatic tire. Imagine what it would have been like back then to ride bicycles in an 800-mile round trip from Missoula to Yellowstone and back. And that was just the first stage of a long series of trips. These same men actually pedaled these bicycles from Fort Missoula all the way to St. Louis, Missouri, a distance of 1,900 miles in 1889. Imagine what the roads were like. Imagine what those bicycles must have been like. But also, I think it's important that we have to understand what the geopolitics at the time were like. African Americans worked tirelessly to protect and preserve these national parks, including the national parks at Yosemite. In 1903, over 400 African Americans were tasked with protecting and patrolling Yosemite under the leadership of a unit known as the Buffalo Soldiers, led by the third graduate of West Point, a man by the name of Charles Young. They built many of the trails that are in existence today, as well as the very first National Park Arboretum and the road leading all the way up to the summit of Mount Whitney, the highest peak at over 14,000 feet in the contiguous United States. The Grand Canyon, even in the 1920s, was a place that was only just now in the process of being preserved. And it was at this time when the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People led a journey there with a man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. At the time, he was the principal scholar and intellectual in the African American community, the first person of color to receive a doctorate degree from Harvard University. And on this trip, he had this to say: "Why do not those who are scarred by the world's battle and hurt by its hardness travel to these places of beauty and drown themselves in the utter joy of life?" So we have this remarkable expression and appreciation for our relationship with nature and the outdoors. And we take a look at where we are today. Very few people of color relative to our percentage of the population actually visit national parks today. But at the turn of the century, as the evidence shows, there were literally thousands, not only visiting, but in active roles of participation. So we have to ask ourselves, what happened? Sadly, at this time, we also have the rise of white supremacy in the United States. At the time of the taking of this photograph, there was over 10 million card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan, including people, namely President Woodrow Wilson, who openly invited marches of unmasked Klansmen in Washington, D.C. And it's estimated that Wilson was the person who helped to segregate many of our national monuments, our national defense. At the time of his inauguration, the U.S. Army was formally segregated. The U.S. Postal Service was segregated. And in 1916, when the National Park Service was established, it was also deemed as segregated. So that the same men who served valiantly as protectors of Yosemite, who went to war in Europe to fight in World War I, could not return to public life to become national park rangers in the early part of the 20th century. And that, oddly enough, gets us back to Alabama, because it's at this point where we're starting to explore more of the history of what was going on that got us to the place that we are today. And specifically, on our way from Anniston to Tuskegee, we made a stop at a place called Horseshoe Bend. Now, this is a place that I had never heard of before. I'd never seen it before. In fact, we're driving along a janky country road in the middle of nowhere, and I see this sign, Horseshoe Bend National Military Park. Now, we're in the South. My immediate assumption was that this must be a Civil War monument, right? Well, it turns out this is actually a monument in the War of 1812. What do you know about the War of 1812? At the time, I knew absolutely nothing, but I got to tell you that this was actually a pivotal point in American history. This is a spot on the Tallahatchie River that is actually U-shaped, and that's why it's called Horseshoe Bend. And it's at this site where a man of national prominence becomes first on the public scene. This is Andrew Jackson. And at the time, he was the leader of the expeditionary forces in the central United States. And it was at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend that the United States forces defeated the Creek Indians. And this is really important because this is the very last of the resistance of the expansion of the United States in North America. And it's at the Treaty of Fort Jackson, where 43 million acres of Native American land is ceded to the United States government. And essentially, it's in this site that we have this incredibly rich and fertile soil that we now are calling the Black Belt. But at the time, it ultimately becomes what is Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And it's also here that we have the beginning of the displacement of Native people. It is here that is the beginning of the Trail of Tears. Native Americans are essentially displaced from this land and ultimately replaced with the agrarian interests of the United States. And in this letter that I discovered in the Library of Congress with the help of a very talented storyteller at Horseshoe Bend National Monument, Andrew Jackson wrote this letter to his wife, Rachel, and described the land as this: the lands through which we pass are some of the richest this country can boast. Well-watered and abundantly fertile, they will no doubt be settled by a happy and prosperous people. So that happy, prosperous people are an influx of white Northerners coming to settle in the South. But this is incredibly rich, deep, dense soil. And unfortunately, it's at this point we have an uptick in the exploitation of African-American labor. And here we have the intensification of slavery in the southern part of the United States. And this is quite literally where it begins. Over the next 50 years, we have an expansion of the institution of slavery so that it is the impetus of what ultimately becomes a civil war. And at this time, over 180,000 black men in U.S. Army uniform fought to achieve their freedom, not only for themselves, but for the nation as a whole. And it is from these units of African-American soldiers that we ultimately defeat the South. We have the beginnings of the concentration of black political power in the South, as well as the creation of several legislative advantages, specifically being able to create the first 7 black members of the U.S. Congress. They primarily come from the states of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. And these men actually were part of the the legislation that created the Yellowstone Act of 1872, creating our very first national park. But during this time of racial segregation, we also have limitations in terms of how and where people of color can travel. These restrictions ultimately are reflected as well in our access to federally protected public land. And we have the beginnings of what will ultimately become the civil rights movement. And from that, we have the rise of several different understandings of what we can do to protect these areas for use as both national monuments, but also for recreation. So here we are again in the Black Belt. And from this area, we have a heavy concentration not only of this fertile soil, but now a heavy concentration of Black Americans that ultimately become the political power that is concentrated in this area to this day. The areas in red indicate the very specific racial demographics of voters in these areas. And notice how it almost perfectly matches the concentration of the soil laid down 70 million years ago. And it also marks the concentration of civil rights monuments in the South, specifically in a location that we had a chance to visit. Now, you probably won't recognize this site, but it is a pivotal moment that is reflected in this area on the Tallahatchie River in 1955. It was here that the body of an African-American young man at the age of 14 by the name of Emmett Till was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, and his body was dumped at this site. His death on August 8th, 1955 marks a galvanizing moment in American history. So that when you go to this site today, now known as Garble Landing, we now tell a new story about what happened in this particular site and what its ramifications were. In this place called Bryant's Grocery Store, Emmett made the mistake of whistling at a white woman. And for that offense, the woman's husband kidnapped him, tortured him, dumped his body, and ultimately created the impetus for a national movement. Because he was so young, his story was tragically told. He was the inspiration for an African-American woman by the name of Rosa Parks who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus less than 3 months later. Rosa Parks later said, "I thought of Emmett Till and I just couldn't go back." This singular moment that began the Montgomery bus boycott inspired an African-American preacher by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. at the age of 26 to move from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia to Montgomery, Alabama to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. And over the next 8 years begins a series of protest marches that ultimately culminates in the March on Washington. Now, we're all familiar with this, but what's ironic is that the March on Washington and the death of Emmett Till happened 8 years to the day, literally coinciding those two events, ultimately beginning a national conversation around the pursuit of dreams. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. If America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. Now, this is a metaphor, but we can take this metaphor and actually take it to a much higher degree of understanding. So Ebony Magazine, a month later, reported the March on Washington as the greatest protest march in U.S. history. Ironically, in this same issue, they profiled an African-American man by the name of Dr. Charles Madison Crenshaw, and he is an aspiring mountaineer. He is a member of the Seattle Mountaineers based in Seattle, Washington, and he describes himself as a weekend climber. But what's especially ironic and where history starts to repeat itself or perhaps rhyme, he was a member of the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. As a flight engineer, he managed the bomber escort planes that flew missions over Germany. And after having graduated, having successfully made it through the war, he went to the University of Chicago, where he earned a PhD in mechanical engineering. But he was told that, quote, as a Negro, it would be very unlikely for you to find a job in your chosen profession. He disavowed that, relocated to Seattle, Washington, and took a job as a flight engineer for the Boeing Corporation, and was part of the quality control team that designed the lunar lander module for the Apollo missions. He quite literally was helping put men on the moon. But he was also an aspiring mountaineer, and as a member of the Seattle Mountaineers, he was invited on the 37th expedition to the highest peak in North America, a mountain then known as Mount McKinley, now we call Denali. And on their way to the summit, this photograph was taken on July 2nd, 1964. And this is particularly significant. That's actually Crenshaw in the large backpack at the end of this knife edge ridge on their way to the summit at over 15,700 feet. As this photograph is taking place, Martin Luther King Jr. is overlooking the shoulder of Lyndon Johnson as the Civil Rights Act is being signed into law. Less than a week later, on July 12th, Crenshaw makes it to the summit of Denali. Now, what's ironic about this photograph is that it's really hard to tell who the black guy is. Just so you know, Crenshaw is the guy on the far left. The guy on the far right is the expedition leader, Alvin Randolph. The person in the middle is Alvin's wife, Frances. That's a woman. She became the third woman to make it to the highest peak in North America. And at the time, what is really remarkable is that it's the perfect illustration of being able to be judged not by the color of your skin, but the content of your character. 7 days after the signing of the Civil Rights Act, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of climbing mountains and reaching to the highest physical points in North America and this country comes true. And what's interesting is that in the expedition law, Crenshaw had this to say: it had been so easy today for most of the climbers that it was hard for them to realize they were actually standing on the summit of Mount McKinley, the highest point in North America. Climbers found themselves searching through the clouds for something yet higher. And that aspirational vision in many ways is what inspires me to do much of the work that I'm doing today. In fact, many of the stories that I tell about exploration, about mountaineering, has a very consistent through line from not only the high peaks of North America, but the many representations of the civil rights movement. And it's by looking back in time through the creation of new stories that we have the ability to reframe our understanding of what ultimately not only recreation, exploration, but also what true adventure looks like. In 2013, I had the privilege of helping to put together the very first all-African-American team ascent of an attempt to climb Denali in a project that we called Expedition Denali. And it was the subject of the documentary film I produced, An American Ascent. From that, we actually, in 2015, were invited to visit the Obama White House to tell this story to over 350 African American and Hispanic youth in the Baltimore, D.C. area. Members of that same expedition, particularly the young lady in front, her name is Rosemary Saul. And 3 years later, she became the leader of the very first all-African American team ascent of Kilimanjaro in 2018. And to say that this is the very first time that an all-African American team climbed the highest peak in Africa is remarkable, but it took until 2018 to make that happen. 4 years after that, she became part of the first all-African American team ascent of Mount Everest, the highest peak in North America. She became the second African American woman, and we put 7 out of 10 climbers on the summit, but everyone made it back home safely. It's from this conversation through our exploration of history that we can quite literally redefine the narrative going back over 70 million years, from the Cretaceous period all the way through the return of African American history through our national parks by telling a story about how people of color have quite literally transformed our national parks to our understanding of what we have today. And from this conversation, we can ultimately shift how we can define who belongs in places, where we go, and ultimately how we can become part of our culture and our own society. From that, we have the ability to understand, as Twain said, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. So I think that it's critical that we go out to find places and ultimately be inspired by the stories of people like York, the Buffalo Soldiers, the Tuskegee Airmen, and also Charles Crenshaw, to more modern interpretations from Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, John Lewis, Martin Luther King Jr., and of course my dad. I think that it's really important that as we are beginning to tell our stories, we ultimately make sure that we don't allow history to get old, because we always know that there's something new to learn. I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me today. I've got a couple of minutes left if anyone has any questions. In the meantime, I hope you'll look for me at joychairproject.com. And most importantly, if you hit my QR code, you can get detailed information about my work and maybe even get in touch with some specific questions. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have an agent? Because Ken Burns, who? You are a great storyteller.
Oh, thank you. I do. Working on a new book, working on it. Yeah, I'm covered. Thanks, though.
I'm not an agent.
Unless you're volunteering, I can always use another agent.
I'm not an agent. I was going to suggest you get one. But as far as, industry-wide, storytelling is back, storytelling is back. This was such a trip filled with joy, listening to this and hearing about this and seeing things and learning. And I personally want to thank you. I think the room is probably moved as I was. I had every emotion going on here, from sadness to anger to enlightenment.
Good. Well, that's the point. Well, and I think perhaps more than anything else, we can come to this work with a better understanding of being able to learn from the past, to be able to allow us to understand how we got to where we are today, and ultimately, hopefully, plot a better, more joyful course into the future. So we hopefully can indeed learn from the past.
Anyone questions? Anyone else?
Young man in the back there.
You briefly talked about the Confederate statues and how most people remove them. So I want to get your opinion. Do you think we should keep the Confederate history alive? Because some people say that it is a part of U.S. history, and majority of Confederate soldiers did not want slavery, but just wanted to preserve their land and their government. But other side says that it's an evil that we should have gotten rid of, and we should not celebrate it. So what is your opinion on this?
That's a really, really great question. And frankly, it's one of those things that I'm happy to entertain, because I definitely think that everyone should be aware of and acknowledge all of their history, including the bad stuff that we'd just as soon forget about. Now, the question isn't so much whether or not we retain the history. The question is whether or not we celebrate the intent of that history. And I think that's part of the problem, because when we celebrate things like Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy. Okay, he was an avowed racist. I mean, the documents of Confederation literally have white supremacy in the language of the founding principles of the Confederacy. So there's no denying that. Should we forget that Jefferson Davis existed? Absolutely not. Should we build statues to him? Probably not. Okay, and I think that's the most explicit difference. But we also have to understand too that, so for example, should we celebrate Thomas Jefferson? He was a slaveholder. George Washington, slaveholder. Here's the principal difference. We can still aspire to the principles of the idea that all men are created equal, because it still makes sense. We can all agree on that today, right? I don't think that we can all collectively agree with the notion of white supremacy. So yes, we should revere Thomas Jefferson, we should revere George Washington, but while we're doing that, we should also talk about people like Benjamin Banneker, who was the principal architect of Washington, D.C., who directly debated with Jefferson regarding the the value of people of color as human beings. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we need to tap into. So we can't literally say, especially as we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, that once America became a nation, everything was good. We only became the nation that we are today because we learned the lessons of the past. We needed to fight a civil war 100 years after the Revolution. We needed to have a civil rights movement 100 years after the Civil War. And now we're reckoning with that same misunderstanding today. So we just need to keep asking the questions and be very thoughtful in our responses so that we're not going to limit our understanding of the past to explicitly the things that we most want to see. Good question, thank you. Anyone else? Yep.
Kind of pursuant to that, so all the work that you're doing with the National Park Service is obviously super impressive. Are you really challenged right now with what's happening with the current administration because of the requests to change stuff at the Smithsonian? I mean, we hear about it all the time, so I'm wondering how your work is affected by this and yeah, you get the question.
So the question is, has my work been impacted by the current administration? The short answer is yes. The long answer is not yet, not really. Okay, and I'm qualifying it with this in that, so currently I'm working on a federal grant to create and I'll just use the words, diversity, equity, and inclusion program to increase awareness among underrepresented segments of the population for the third least visited national park in the system. Anybody care to guess what park that is? I bet you've never even heard of it. Third least visited national park in the system. Okay, the first least visited is Gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska. The second is American Samoa. Okay, the third is Isle Royale. Okay, Isle Royale is an island off the coast of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan on Lake Superior. You can't drive there. It's currently closed because it's packed in ice right now. And the only way to get there is by boat or seaplane. And so the question is, how do we raise awareness enough so that people even know that it exists? And how can we create a pathway through which people who, once they have heard of it, can actually get there? And it is so hard to get there, even when you know about it. I literally was trying to plan in July a trip in October and was told that all of the boat ride seats were taken up through the end of the year. So it was going to be another 6 months before I can even apply to go again. And so this grant essentially is designed to help to correct that. But because of our programming language, because of the executive order, we've been very cagey about how we're talking about it now. The program's still happening, the money's still coming, but I'm horrified that the Department of Interior is going to say, dude, you're talking explicitly about getting black and brown people to this national park. We can't allow that. No one has said that yet. You know, and I'm almost loath to even have this conversation now in the off chance that word might get out that this is what we're doing. But literally, we're at the point right now where we're just continuing to do the work. We're continuing to engage with folks who will definitely benefit from an understanding and appreciation for these sites, and hopefully encourage more people to visit on a regular basis. So the work continues, and all I can ask is that each of you, whenever you can, visit your national parks. Support the gateway communities that you will pass through. Sleep in their hotels, eat in their restaurants, hire their guides, buy their trinkets and souvenirs, because that's ultimately what keeps our parks open and working. And the more people who use them, the longer that we will have them. Thank you.
Thank you.